Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.
Well, hello and welcome to Engage for Success Radio with me, Jo Moffat. Today's show, number 541, is going to be looking at the topic of masculine leadership post-pandemic. But before we get onto that and before I introduce today's guest, a little bit about Engage for Success for those who may not be too familiar with who we are. So Engage for Success is a not-for-profit movement, and we're the UK's leading voice on the topic of employee engagement. We're raising awareness and running online and in-person events through our area networks around the country. And we have topic and sector-specific thought and action groups who look at developing research, publishing case studies, and generally shining a light on great practice in particular sectors and particular areas of the topic. So do visit us at engageforsuccess.org, where you can learn more about the movement, and you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter. So, as I say, I'm Jo Moffat, and as with everyone who's involved in Engage for Success, I am a volunteer. I'm one of the regular hosts of Engage for Success Radio, but my day job is that as Managing Director and founder of Woodreed, I help lead a specialist agency where we help our clients create great places to work, high-performing cultures of engaged employees. So my passion is really all things to do with employee engagement, employee experience, internal communication, and of course a key part of all of that is leadership behaviour and team leader behaviour, people manager behaviour. And so today's topic is a really interesting one. And to help us navigate that, I'm very pleased to welcome our special guest, Jim Bishop. Jim is from an organisation called Conjunction Leadership, and he has got over 2 decades of working in executive development, corporate leadership, and human performance. So very much aligned, I think, certainly in the conversations we were having before we came on air, with much of the thinking that we have at Engage for Success, but obviously with a very specific focus on the role of leadership. So welcome to today's show, Jim.
Thank you, Jo. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's good to have you with us. So let's just, in a moment, I want to just dissect today's topic title a little bit more with you. But before we do that, I wonder if you could just give our listeners a little potted history, a little quick potted overview of your background and how you came to be delivering the role that you deliver now, and how you set up Conjunction Leadership in 2020.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. So 16 and a half years in corporate America, trained as a scientist, and realizing that once I was working in science, the unsolvable problem was really around the human element that made the science work. So I started bringing solutions around the human stuff to how teams work and how leaders perform, and different ideas and impacts about training and onboarding and retaining employees to my customers in order to gain more time with them to talk about the science, and realized that I actually had quite a passion and a bent for it, and I could consume hours of the day and of the evening just researching and studying more. So I started following that path into instructional design, adult education, curriculum development. Moved into training and development for a little while, moved into organizational development, executive development, ultimately into my executive career. With that mindset, though, what I was seeing was that we were spending a lot of time putting people in classroom education when really what they needed was an idea session or a mind-bending session where they would change a mindset. And so I started getting into more coaching at that point. I got my coaching certification in 2016, coached internally for several years. And then in 2020, when the world was upside down and leaders were really grappling with what does leadership mean in this new era, and what does the employee value proposition, how is it shifting? I realized that this was going to be another unsolvable issue. And so in 2020, I set up my business called Conjunction Leadership. And the name of the business is indicative of, I believe in the and. A lot of leaders in the overwhelming state of life get caught in the bind of the either or. Their mind splits into 2 extremes, and then those are really the only options they see. But in an idea session or in a quiet, protected space of coaching, what we're able to do is come up with the how we put those two things together and help people come up with a third and fourth and fifth options in their arsenal so that they can figure out where they want to go and what do they want to do and how do they get to their better life and their better self.
Got you. Okay, that's excellent. So thank you for that. So we're going to be talking today then about masculine leadership post-pandemic. So I just want to perhaps understand before we go on too much further on that. Do you mean masculine leadership as delivered by males, or do you mean masculine leadership as a style of leadership which can be demonstrated by anyone in a leadership role?
Great clarification on that. Really, what a lot of the people who have been finding me since I've been out on my own have been mostly men, and so in that definition, I mean it to be the leadership style delivered by people who would identify as a male, and just because of the shifting dynamics, the way that there's just some unique differences about the ways that men think and the way men have been culturalized, that the pandemic and everything that occurred in 2020 shifted. So really that title and that topic really just means how are men pivoting, or how do they need to pivot in order to potentially lead much differently in this new world than they did in the previous world.
Okay, so so it'd be interesting to explore that, and then perhaps we'll bring it back at the end to think, well, I wonder if some of these traits women would already be demonstrating, or maybe not. I don't know. So what did you see in 2020 as so radically changing the way people needed to lead?
Yeah. So I think there are it's important for us to kind of go back and reset that moment, as painful as it may be for many people, right? But the entire feeling of the pandemic, the isolation that occurred, the disruptions that naturally occurred in the way that we conducted business and got products to customers or services to customers, and the way that we interrelated with one another. And that created an entire reset of what people expect from their workplace. Secondarily, later on in that summer of 2020, we started experiencing a lot of the social injustice issues that were coming to surface and bringing to light. And there was a lot more focus on the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on companies and organizations, right? So I think with those two kind of capstone moments, there were a lot of shifts that occurred. And sometimes I feel like my male counterparts just missed it in many cases. And I was privy to watching this happen and sitting beside many leaders at this time in coaching sessions. And what I would see is that more times than not, what would happen is, because of the isolation, because of all the turmoil that was going on, employees just expected more, right? They needed to talk about what was happening in a different way. We weren't connected to our social groups nearly as much. We weren't connected to our families as much. And the one time where we were spending a bulk of our day was either on Zoom calls or on some sort of virtual technology, and we were connecting with our colleagues. And people had a natural desire to just share about who they were or what they were experiencing during this time. And yet most of my male colleagues that were leading teams, organizations, or even businesses at that point in time were so focused on solving what they perceived as the immediate problem of getting product to customers and keeping the revenue line going and making sure that employees stayed employed. Those are all valuable and necessary things. And sometimes, though, because of the way that they were flooded with all of these different things, they were focusing on that problem at the expense of solving some of the social connection issues that were going on in the workplace. Jim,
sorry, can I just interrupt you a moment? Just to hold that thought, as we say. I mean, one of the things that's been spoken about a lot is a good thing that came out of the pandemic was the fact that leaders had to come out from behind the sort of highly scripted town hall presentations of organizational messages and agendas to their people, and actually be much more authentic and more human, and show more of themselves in terms of their true self. Is that part of what you're talking about when you're talking about employees expecting more?
Absolutely. And I think you've you've seen it. We've all felt it. There are some leaders who did that way more naturally and authentically, and then there were other leaders who were kind of pushed into that space, and it didn't feel very authentic or genuine, or it didn't set a model something for other people to follow, right? So this is the do's and the don'ts that we're starting to get into. And we can definitely name leaders or key leaders we would have wanted to follow during that period of time. And then we definitely saw leaders who we felt were probably hiding or posturing and saying what they needed to say, but maybe not authentically feeling it, right? So
yeah, sure. Yeah, I interrupted you anyway. My apologies. You were in full flow.
No, that's good. I appreciate that distinction. And that is the distinction. It is those types of leaders who kind of missed that opportunity and who never really developed the emotional flexibility to be able to step into the space and know what appropriate levels of vulnerability look like. And, you know, when they didn't know what to do, and because no one had been there before, you know, no one wants a leader that stands up and says, I have no idea where we're going and things are going to crap and we're falling down the tubes, right? No one wants a leader like that. But there were many leaders who wanted to be that emotionally vulnerable because they wanted people in their camp, if you will. And then there are other leaders who didn't want to be vulnerable at all and said, I absolutely know what we're going to do. And this is the plan. And this is the plan. And this is the plan. And then we got a new piece of data or a new report on the virus spread. And what was happening was those plans went out the window, and it made the leaders look like they didn't really know what they were doing. Right. So somewhere in the balance is that fine level of vulnerable authenticity where a leader can share their emotion appropriately and recognize emotions in others so that you can create a safe spot for that emotional outlet to be there. I think that was the first piece of information or first piece of leadership that shifted. And employees used to get, you know, back several decades ago, we used to be more connected to our nuclear families. We used to be more connected to potentially to our communities. We weren't as much of a mobile society. And when all of those things were pulled apart from people, the last remaining institution that they relied upon was their workplace. And it wasn't written anywhere that was an expectation of leadership, but it certainly became an obvious one. And when it didn't get met, you saw what happened in 2021 and thereafter with the Great Resignation. And employees just felt like, I need to go be seen. I need to go be heard somewhere because I'm not feeling that in my current workplace. I think the second piece that shifted during that period of time in masculine leadership was directly related to some of the social injustice issues that were going on and the rising of these DEI issues. And I think they were completely valid. But what we were seeing was an imbalance of power to some extent, that many of the people who had risen to positions of leadership happened to be from a white male-dominated background. And when we had to grapple with some of the injustices that had occurred in the past and that we needed to make it right, then what was happening was some of those people in leadership started to fear. They started to lead out of fear and feeling as if, what happens if I'm no longer needed? Or what happens if I'm no longer in positions of leadership? And no one leads well out of fear. Right? We tend to make reactionary decisions. We tend to protect a little bit more. And that throws us even further back in our vulnerability curve. And I would see several of my white male counterpart leaders behaving in such a way that maybe they were saying the right words and maybe there were initiatives going on around them, but in their own spirit, they were still feeling as if they were not certain or not sure about where their position was going to be in the future or where their leadership might be needed. And I felt like those two things, you know, helping people feel more heard and seen in the workplace and also not leading out of a spirit of fear are really the two pieces that shifted most during that period of time. And I still think there are a lot of leaders grappling with that even yet today. Yeah,
right. And so it's not really the same though as going through a sort of tick box exercise of standing up and saying, yes, I agree with equality, diversity and inclusion agenda, and yes, we would support X, Y, Z, and not meaning it. What you're describing is a little bit more embedded than that. It's a sense of fear about this wave of change that's coming down the track, and how is that a threat to me as a white male leader?
Correct. Yeah. it may not have been from the president or the CEO, but there is certainly, and I think there still is, a large group in the middle management level who is scratching their head and wondering if there are places for everyone else, then where is my place anymore? And we're still working through these issues and helping people figure that out.
So what's the solution then? What if those are the two big fundamental shifts, sociological, psychological shifts that came about as a result of the pandemic? What do male leaders, particularly who might recognise those things and their shortcomings in regards to those, or their innate responses, be they think, well, actually, yeah, I can see that perhaps that might be me. What do they need to do?
Yeah, well, as if they say in all recovery programs, recognition is the first step of recovery. And so if someone is actually recognizing it, they're already one step further than a lot of leaders are. But once they recognize it, then they can start taking responsibility for it. I think that's a large part where my practice of coaching has evolved from, is people reaching out going, I know something has shifted. I'm not happy with where I'm at. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing differently, but I know there has to be a different way. It's in that quiet and protected space where they can completely be emotionally vulnerable. I don't judge and I don't evaluate. I give them the opportunity to share whatever they want to share and how they're currently feeling. And what we're already starting to do in that moment is to develop some greater emotional dexterity. And so if they can name what emotions they're feeling, then they are able to be in control of those emotions. But if a lot of men haven't really developed the emotional literacy to understand what they're truly feeling, they probably have access on the surface to 4 or 5 basic emotions, but they don't understand the derivations underneath of it. And so as an example, when they say, I feel angry, anger is generally a secondary emotion, and there's probably a primary one that they're feeling first. Maybe it might be shame, or it might be frustration, or it might be hurt. When they feel shame, someone has spoken into something that they know they're not very good at, as an example. Then they might get angry because they're trying to deflect, and they don't want other people to see that. So what I help them do is just try to get more comfortable with truly what are they feeling so that they can be in control of those emotions, because if they're not, what is happening is those emotions are controlling them. And that's when the secondary start showing up. More broadly is they can start placing themselves around greater degrees of difference, right? Making sure they're not just focusing on solving the hard and fast problems of getting product to customers, but potentially even just how are they solving the problem of making sure that people are seen, valued, and respected in their workplace. And it doesn't start with an initiative. That doesn't start with your HR team or your CHRO announcing a big company-wide thing. That starts with you as a leader sitting down with somebody who isn't like you and listening to their story, understanding where they're coming from, and acknowledging the fact that their background and their experience is as relevant as yours is, but they might have a completely different perspective on the same information that you're looking at because of the way that they are selecting the data that makes sense to them. And
so I would say, Jim, what that's suggesting to me then, I suspect, is that you're a big advocate of leaders getting out and walking the floor, getting out into the field, wherever, going out and meeting and engaging with their people, wherever those people might be, and actually hearing it directly.
Yes, that can be one way. I mean, and as you and I were chatting even before the show started, another way is just for them to understand how to appropriately use their vulnerability, right? And lowering their guard just enough to share enough about themselves that makes other people want to share about them. But unfortunately, a lot of leaders were kind of brought up in an era where the mindset was never let them see you sweat, or where emotional vulnerability could be exploited. And so if a leader has a brand that they're not greatly approachable, or that most people know only their resume items about them, then it's not unheard of for those employees not to share a lot with the boss or with the leader. They'll tell them the factual things, they'll sugarcoat the truth, and they'll probably give them the bigger context of what's going on, but they're not dropping into the emotional context of how that makes people feel. And so a leader kind of has to go first in this journey about lowering the waterline just enough that allows people want to pour their story back into that.
Yes, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you so I know you're very much, your role is around executive development and leadership coaching and so on. But you also touched on, when you were talking just now, you touched on that very often, particularly in middle management, you see some of this fear and an inability to be authentic, perhaps. But you particularly talked about the fear. And whereas organisations perhaps are very happy to invest in coaching for their senior teams, individual coaching for their senior teams, I'm guessing it's not that widely applied at lower levels of management, team leaders, team managers level. So how can people take on the sort of points you're making in that strata of an organisation? And is that very much, well, you better just go and read up on it and educate yourself? Or are there ways in which this kind of thinking the benefit of this kind of approach can be brought to bear with middle management teams too?
Oh, yeah, there certainly is. I mean, there's opportunities for group coaching and, maybe it's not the intensive one-on-one as we do with some executives, but I'm a firm believer that once it's modeled, it can be caught more than it's taught, right? And so, again, back to my business model, I prefer to work with a leader who wants to go first in the journey, and then we bring their team along behind them. And then from the team, we take that on to the next level, and then the next level, and we start replicating that out across the organization. So in many cases, once an executive gets their mind on where they want to be and how they're pivoting and changing, they start communicating that and showing up differently. Then we'll put the team together behind them and bring them into the same kind of conversations that the leader just went through, but we do it on a larger group. And then from there, from the group, we'll take it maybe to the organization. And ultimately what happens is an engaged workforce and culture, quote unquote, starts popping out. And it just means that we've pivoted a few behaviors from the top that other people are saying, hey, I can model that. And then once more people model that, it's replicated across the organization. And we have people like us doing things like that, which is really the definition of culture.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I know within your organization, you have a process which you call disrupt, bridge, and grow. Is that what you're talking about here then, really, that you start off at the top and then things fan out behind that?
Not necessarily. The disrupt, bridge, and grow process is more of the framework by which we follow the coaching journey. For leaders who say, they'll often come to me and say, I desire growth and this is where I want to be. But in order to get somewhere different, it usually started with a belief or a behavior that they held on to. And in order to do something different, we have to kind of get behind what is that belief or behavior. So back to that mindset of, if I was brought up in an environment where the model of leadership was never let them see you sweat, or, don't share too much, it will be weaponized against you. Then I have to defeat that belief. And that defeating of the belief can be the greatest disruption process. It takes a long time to unlearn something that has become part of someone's identity. And so we spend a fair bit of time in the disrupt phase. Then we start looking at what is the bridge phase. What am I going to have to do or do differently to get to where I want to be? And then the growth phase is really when the client just comes back to me and every session is saying, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm growing, here's where I'm going to go next, here's what I want to do. And I get to be privy to being the accountability partner at that point. Usually through the disrupt phase, I'm a little bit more, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a trained mental health therapist, but on the same point, I am a pretty good belief spotter. And so what I do during those periods of time is just kind of put a push pin in some of the beliefs that people have. We pin those to the board and then they can start looking at them and going, are those beliefs serving me or not? Once they decide, do I want to hold on to them or do I want to get rid of them? Then they can decide how much do I want to grow. So,
right, I see. It's interesting. I mean, our topic today was masculine leadership post-pandemic, and we clarified what we meant by that. And I don't particularly like putting people in boxes of around gender and so on and stereotypes, but I'm going to have to do that for the sake of the next question for you, Jim, which is, in the light of what you were saying about those two trends or those two great shifts that occurred as a result of the pandemic in 2020 and beyond, and I know you said that you by and large have worked with male leaders, so you may feel that you want to plead the Fifth Amendment on this one. But do you think women were, by and large, better equipped to deal with those changes?
Well, anecdotally, I can tell you what I have seen. I don't know that this is exclusive, and I'm not going to say that it's binary and that it's always this way or the other. But during that period of time, what I would see is my female colleagues being the ones that stepped up to their male colleagues and said, okay, we've got to start our calls or our meetings much differently. We can't just start with the agenda of the day. We have to let people talk about where they're at. So they started processes like check-in questions, or they would wrap up conversations with, something that was more on a personal note or a connected note. And it was by far and large my female colleagues who were adding the humanness to our otherwise very structured workplaces. And when the pandemic started, February, March, April, depending on where you happen to be, but by the time we got to May, June, and July, people were burnt out of just being on back-to-back Zoom calls. And if it weren't for some of those female leaders during that period of time, there would have been a lot more burnout. And I think they were shouldering a lot of the emotional burden that was going on in the workplaces, trying to absorb it and figure out how to deal with it. So, interesting.
I think that's good. I'm glad you absorbed that and acknowledged that, because interesting. Interesting. You should say that. And where do you think we're at now? I mean, we're 4 years on. Do you think that has been a powerful enabler for women in leadership, or has that sort of dropped back?
I've seen tremendous shifts there, and I love what is happening today. I love that male leaders are learning from their female colleagues, and female colleagues are learning from their male colleagues, and there appears to be, in many cases, at least the companies that I'm working with, a greater leveling of, we're not talking about gender as much. We're talking about what good leadership looks like. And there are people in all genders that are rising to that level of leadership of how do we make the workplace more human and dynamic and sociable, which is what the employee value proposition is about these days. It's not just about earning a paycheck, and it's not just about doing good. It's about also being seen and recognized for doing good and being a human in my workplace.
Yeah. Jim, I want to close now. Unfortunately, we've flown through. We've got a couple of minutes left. And in that last couple of minutes, I'd like to just ask you, and you've sort of led up to that really nicely, actually, which is, I just want to close with one final question for you, which is then, in your view and from your decades of experience, is the difference between a good leader and somebody who really is a great leader?
Yeah. Well, I think it's cliche, but a great leader doesn't lead because they're trying to gain followers. They gain followers because they're trying to bring people along with them, right? I think there's a lot of good leaders out there who have heard that adage, you're not a leader unless you have followers. But the great ones just naturally know how to lead in their humanness that make people want to come along with them, that people are just gravitating towards it. And it has to do with that human dynamic in today's environment. I mean, we used to follow leaders who got good results. Today, we want to follow great leaders who help us feel that we are belonging to something that's bigger than ourselves and that we're doing great work doing it. So,
and at the heart of that is having a quite deep well of emotional dexterity. In your view.
Absolutely. I think that's the one thing that separates us from the robots, right, is the human to human element and the empathy that we can share for one another. And so my message to most leaders is that's the thing you're going to need to develop if you want to go further in your leadership journey, is the emotional dexterity. And candidly, it's even the literacy before the dexterity, just to understand what emotion am I experiencing and what emotions are other people experiencing. And when you connect in that, the problems of the day tend to get a little bit less.
Yeah. As you said, recognition is the first step to solving a problem, but recognition is also the first step to building on what you are and what you have, and then take it from there. So that's us out of time. So thank you very much to today's special guest, Jim Bishop from Conjunction Leadership. Thank you for listening to Engage for Success Radio. And don't forget, you can download or stream any of the great shows from our archive at any time. Just visit engageforsuccess.org. That's where you can also sign up for our newsletter or get involved in the movement if you want to bring your energies and skill set to bear in our mission to inspire people and workplaces to thrive. So thank you very much, Jim Bishop, and thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Thanks, Joe.
Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.